Hello and welcome to the Get Lit Festival. I'm Kate Peterson, Director of Get Lit Programs, a nonprofit housed within Eastern Washington University. Get Lit is a week-long celebration of literature traditionally held in Spokane, Washington. This year, all of our events are virtual and virtually all of them are free. To learn more about Get Lit, to find this year's schedule of events, or to donate, please click on the link below to visit our website, getlitfestival.org. Now I'd like to introduce Claire Walla, Get Lit's Assistant Coordinator.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you all for joining us for Ekphrasis, Art in Conversation. This session on ekphrastic prose will explore the evolving tradition of writing inspired by visual art. In collaboration with Spokane's Museum of Arts and Culture, today's authors will use a how-to, hands-on, live laboratory approach to model ekphrasis in real time, equipping audience members with the tools necessary to investigate the practice in their own work. Before we hand it over to the authors, we'd like to give them each a brief introduction. Karina Cook is the author of the essay collection Leave Takings. Supported by a 2018-19 Fulbright Fellowship, a 2018 Alaska Literary Award, and a 2020 Project Award from the Rasmussen Foundation, she is currently writing an ekphrastic essay collection that looks at Alaska Yukon artwork and searches for ways to live with colonial history. Karina holds a PhD in English and Creative Writing from the University of Missouri.
Our next author is Jenny Davis. We can't edit these things, so I'm going to make our person edit that part real quick. Our next author is Jenny Davis, a Spokane-based writer and teacher. Jenny's MFA in Creative Nonfiction is from the University of Iowa. Her publications in literary magazines include pieces in Gettysburg Review and Creative Nonfiction, among others. Her essays have twice been notable in the Best American Essay Series and once nominated for a Pushcart Prize. Locally, Jenny runs a weekly community creative writing group and has also collaborated with the Museum of Arts and Culture on ekphrastic workshops in years past.
Our final author is Courtney Harler, a freelance writer, editor, and educator based in Las Vegas, Nevada. She holds an MFA from Sierra Nevada University and an MA from Eastern Washington University. Courtney has been honored by fellowships from Writing by Writers, the Community of Writers, and Nevada Arts Council. Courtney's written work, which includes poetry, prose, literary analysis, essays, book and film reviews, interviews, and hybrid pieces, has been published around the world. Now we'll hand it over to our authors.
Thank you so much, Claire and Kate, Get Lit, for having us, and for everybody out there for attending our session. As Kate said, my name is Jenny, and I am here in Spokane. So I've been interested in the connections between different art forms for a very long time. I grew up with two parents who were pianists, and I became a writer. And so I've thought a lot over the years about how these different forms of expression can talk to each other. And that is sort of how I ended up collaborating with the Spokane Museum of Arts and Culture in the first place, which I've been doing, as Kate said, since 2019, leading ekphrastic writing workshops using the museum's collection, including images like one that we're going to talk about here in this panel today. So I'm super excited to be here talking ekphrastic prose with Karina and Courtney.
And hi all, and welcome. Many thanks to the Get Lit Festival organizers. Super cool to be here with Jenny and Courtney. For myself, I'm Karina Cook. I'm an essayist. I'm speaking to you from Dena'ina Elnena in Anchorage, Alaska. And I also like to acknowledge the lands of the Occoquan Tlingit in Juneau, Alaska, where I was born and raised, and which occasioned the essays in my collection, Leave Takings. So my work with ekphrasis and with the ekphrastic essay in particular was sparked by an art exhibit at the Alaska State Museum, I guess 4 or 5 years ago now, called Decolonizing Alaska. And I started dialoguing very closely with arts and artwork at that time because I recognized it was not so much policy driving the social and ecological and philosophic questions that I'm engaged with, but rather artists. So I've published a handful of ekphrastic pieces. I'm excited to have an ekphrastic essay chapbook forthcoming with Porphyry Press. And as Claire mentioned, I'm currently writing a Yukon and Alaska-based ekphrastic essay collection. More info and all this and the other projects at karinacook.com. Thanks.
Hi again, I'm Courtney Harler. As Claire mentioned, I did graduate work here at Eastern, so I am excited to return to the area, even if only virtually. My interest in ekphrasis actually dates back to my time at Eastern when I attended an event at the art gallery on the Cheney campus. My ekphrastic experimentations eventually led to a short story publication last year in a UK magazine. And that particular publication in turn inspired me to start sharing my experience with ekphrastic prose with others. So I'm honored to be here at Get Lit this year, especially with my fellow panelists, Jenny and Karina.
Awesome. Okay, so let's dive in. In this session, we are going to talk about what ekphrastic prose is. We're going to demonstrate what creating it looks like for all three of us, who are writers coming at it from different angles. And then we're going to leave you with suggestions for how to incorporate ekphrastic practice into your own work. So starting with the obvious first question, what is ekphrasis? So the word comes from a Greek phrase more or less meaning description. It's literally speak and out, plus to call an inanimate object by its name. And you'll even find a variety of pronunciations among native speakers of English. I think here among the three of us, you might hear some combination of ekphrasis, ekphrasis, ekphrasis. I'm going to try to stick with ekphrasis, but who knows? Broadly speaking, what it is a way of using one type of art to engage with another type of art. So ekphrastic writing is writing that vividly brings to life by description or inspiration, art that is not text-based, so the reader has a new experience of the art being described. So a lot of readers and writers come to encounter ekphrastic writing in the form of poetry first. For example, Keats's famous early 19th century Ode on a Grecian Urn, in which Keats addresses an ancient Grecian urn, describing the scenes depicted on the urn in such vivid lyricalness as to, by the end of the ode, ultimately be describing the relationship between art and human experience. Prose writers can engage with art just as dramatically as poets, to similar ends. Ekphrastic writing can serve as a bridge between any work of art, and we can be talking about music or painting or sculpture, and the written word. And when we allow our writing to be influenced by or attempt to describe another piece of art, we're illuminating the relationships between them. Ekphrastic prose writing, then, is keeping a piece of non-written art central to the creation of a piece of writing, whether that's through lyrical description of the piece of art or through inspiration derived from the piece of art. In other words, what we're doing when we create ekphrastic prose is making art engage with other art in order to deepen the experience of both arts. So for our purposes today, we're going to keep it super broad like that. Okay, so we wanted to jump off with a little bit of historical context and give some examples of what it is we're talking about. So I'm going to attempt to share my screen here and talk through some of what we've seen ekphrasis in history. And then I'm going to do this. Okay, this works, yes? Okay, so one of the earliest examples of what we're talking about comes from Plato's Republic, way back, in which he talks about how a bed, for example, has the quality of bedness that harkens back to an ideal archetype or form of a bed. So here in reality, different beds can have different qualities of bedness depending on the way that they're made. And so have a relationship with the ideal form of what a bed can be, but are necessarily representational. So in other words, to dramatically oversimplify all of Plato's ideas, the idea is that the more you look, the more you see. In other words, if you look at two different types of beds, you're adding to your initial understanding of what bedness is. If you get under those two beds and look at them from that angle, you learn even more. If you paint a picture of a bed, you're creating another angle from which you can see bedness. Then, if you write a vivid description of that painting, you're getting even closer to understanding the ideal form of bedness. Artists in any medium then, according to Plato, can use one kind of art to reflect on another in an attempt to get closer to the ideal form by describing it more completely. This is often ostensibly what we're doing when we perform ekphrasis in a contemporary setting too. So next up, we have an example from Homer. In the Iliad, Homer takes 130 lines to describe the shield of Achilles. This is the shield that Achilles carries into battle with Hector. It's forged by the gods with scenes of war and peace and all kinds of extraordinary imagery. Homer's vivid poetic description of the shield not only would have made the epic easier for orators to recite, given that it's often easier to remember dramatic scenes, but it's also the earliest example of ekphrasis in ancient Greek poetry. So there's a lot of ekphrasis happening throughout the Renaissance. We see it in Cervantes' work. He wrote a lot of frescoes and paintings in Don Quixote, and in Shakespeare, some of Shakespeare's plays, but his sort of most deep foray into ekphrasis is the 200 lines of his narrative poem, The Rape of Lucrece, that described the Greek army before Troy. Then jumping forward to the 19th century, you've got such ekphrasis as seen in Russian composer Mussorgsky's Pictures at an Exhibition, which is a suite of 10 pieces for piano, composed in engagement with a series of watercolors and drawings by an artist named Victor Hartmann. What I think is really cool about this is that Pictures at an Exhibition is still a super famous piece of piano music, but most of the images that inspired the original composition have since been lost. So what we have is just the response to the pictures that's musical. And then we've got this excellent example from Moby Dick, which uses ekphrasis to comment on itself. So in chapter 3 of Moby Dick, Ishmael encounters a mural on the wall of the inn that he walks into, and he spends some time describing what the mural looks like. And as in his description, at first it's chaotic and unclear. It's kind of a mess. What's going on in the picture, he's not sure what's there. But as he looks closer and looks more, he finds that there are so many ways one can interpret it that all of the interpretations for him lead back to resolving into a whale. So this is a way of commenting not just on the story or what's happening within the story of Moby Dick, but also on the sort of larger scale work itself that Melville is organizing around this principle. So, okay, you get the idea. Ekphrastic writing then generally engages with art, both real and imagined, and in doing so manages to paint a fuller picture than any single picture could on its own. So let's see. Next up, Courtney is going to give us another take by exploring a contemporary ekphrastic collaboration.
Thank you, Jenny. Let me just share my screen with you so you can take a look at the painting I'm going to talk about. Good? Okay. So today I want to discuss two artists, Amy Cutler and Amy Bender, and their ekphrastic collaboration known as Tiger Mending, which is the painting you have on the screen. So we'll start with Cutler's original art and then move into Bender's short story. So I want you to have a nice long look at Cutler's fascinating painting, so I'll leave it up on the screen while I discuss the collaboration. Amy Cutler is a critically acclaimed artist from New York, and this particular piece is from 2003. So I'll start the conversation by asking my fellow panelists to briefly respond to the painting. So Jenny, what's happening here?
A lot. There's a lot happening here. So what I see it looks like three female figures wielding sewing needles, and we've got a collection of tigers who appear to be being sewn up by the women. They've got rips in their hides, and they seem to be sick or in pain or something like that. The whole thing is taking place in what looks like a field.
Okay, good. Karina, which element speaks to you most?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I'm really taken by the stripes. This repetition of black stripes on orange is what's most intriguing to me visually. And the more I look at those stripes, the more I pick up on a similar kind of striped repetition in the, the theater of ferns surrounding these figures.
Ah, nice. I like that a lot. So Jenny, what story comes to mind?
Oh, that's a great question. So to me, there's immediately something magical happening here, that the human beings and tigers are sharing the same space so closely. It may be that the tigers are dead, or there's something about their countenance that suggests stuffed animalness to me, and that may be because of the actual sewing involved. But overall, the imagery puts me in mind of everything here being under some kind of spell.
A spell. I like that a lot. Karina, I'll ask you the same question. What story comes to mind for you?
To me, a story makes me think beginning, middle, and end, and some kind of change. And here I see a lot of continuity. So the main change that comes up for me is I guess the orientation or the arrangement of the tiger. So we have the human figure that remains kind of in the same posture throughout, and then these slightly changing orientations of the tiger, and then this stable, surrounding in vegetation. So the story that comes out to me is that there's something in the human-tiger relationship that's continuous, with something very shifting going on in the tiger's world.
Great, wonderful. So thank you very much for playing along and giving me those thoughtful and very imaginative responses. I really appreciate that. My point being is that the ekphrastic process truly begins with that initial unfiltered reaction, with the kind of openness to all the possibilities you might see in the art. So now that you've seen the painting, we've talked about it a little bit, before I jump into Bender's story, I want to first introduce you to an interview between the two Amy's, Amy Bender and Amy Cutler, which was conducted by a writer named Alex Baer for Propeller Quarterly in 2011. So Baer calls this interview Talking Tiger Fur, and in it, we get a really great glimpse into their creative process here. So I'll read you a few sections from the interview very briefly. So Baer asks Bender, did you contact Cutler while you were writing Tiger Mending, the story, or just go with the initial impulse until it was done? Were you challenged by wanting to guess what the painter's intent was, or just take the image as an initial set of characters or a mood? And then Bender responds, I did that solely on my own. I wanted to just have a conversation with the painting itself. I guess I don't really think intent should be that key. She may have one intent and I may see something really different in it. But I did feel shy or nervous when she read it. And at that moment, I felt worried that the story would be very different than what she might hope or expect. So despite Bender saying intent is not that key, I do think it is a really key idea here, or we might even call it kind of the spirit of the work. So both artists can have their own intent, but I think it's important as a writer in particular to stay true to the spirit of the work from which you write. Your story as a writer is your own, but it's also an homage to its inspiration. So I keep that idea in mind as I draft and revise. And also, if you ever publish an Ekphrastic piece, you want to be sure to create a credit to that original art and to explicitly credit the original art. So here's another tidbit from the interview to show you how Ekphrasis is evolving. So Baer asks Bender, have you done similar projects with artists before, and how was this project different? And Bender says, I do like collaborations, have done some with composers, Jenny mentioned, and I've written other stories off paintings, but I've not had a rapport with the painter before. So the two Amy's did talk after their collaboration. Bender says, being able to talk to Amy after was a complete treat. And she has since shown me photos on the web of tattoos based on the images from tiger mending, which was kind of thrilling for both of us. So here we see how the tradition is evolving into many other forms, as Jenny mentioned. But now I want to take us back into Bender's story. So many of the writers in the audience may be more familiar with Bender than Cutler. Bender is the author of several books, and her story, Tiger Mending, comes from her 2013 collection called The Color Master. I'm going to give you a few excerpts just to give you an introduction to her approach, but I won't include any spoilers. I hope you read the story after today's panel if you haven't already. So the story begins, quote, "My sister got the job. She's the overachiever, and she went to med school for 2 years before she decided she wanted to be a gifted seamstress," end quote. If you look at the painting, you can see where the sisters might come in, and you can certainly see the sewing bit. What Bender is doing here is propelling us into the story by giving us an occasion for change. I love that Karina mentioned that earlier. We know right away that the sisters are close and that their lives are about to change. The sisters travel to the new job, but it's not until much later in the story that we actually meet the tigers. So Bender writes the story from the non-sewing sister's perspective. And this sister hears, quote, "A bad moaning sound, a real bad, real mournful moaning sound coming from the north outside that reminded me of the worst loneliness, the worst long, lonely night." The Amazonian with the short, shining cap of hair nodded. "Those are the tigers," she said, end quote. And I find that last line just simply thrilling. Even if not knowing the painting prior, it's just so ominous, so evocative, yet so matter of fact. I will grant you that the story is more about the sisters than the tigers. But that recalls us to the idea of intent. Bender uses the sisters to tell one possible version of the story of Cutler's painting. So now I believe we're back to Karina, who will talk more about the Ekphrastic essay.
Thanks, Courtney. I'll let you take your screen down too. What I'm going to talk about for this next part is the Ekphrastic protest essay, or Ekphrastic essays of resistance. There's a trend in the contemporary creative nonfiction essay, a trend I see as a coinciding or a repeated coming together of ekphrastic form on one hand, with themes of resistance, power, protest, and privilege on the other hand. Simply put, I'm seeing a lot of recently published ekphrastic essays working in service of resistance. Or on the other side of the coin, I'm seeing a lot of recently published protest essays that dialogue with works of art. So a word on form, I'm speaking specifically about essays here in this section. And I invite you to think of the essay on its own literary and historic theoretical terms. Of course, you remember that the word essay comes to us from the French essai. An essai in French is both an attempt in noun form, or it's also the act of attempting as a verb. Understood as literature, then, an essay asks a question and tries or attempts to answer it. An essay follows an idea or a line of thought, and it mimics the roving movement of the human mind, again, in an attempt to figure something out. Importantly, French gets its word essai from Latin for the act of weighing, as in with a scale. See? So therefore, an essay is an attempt. It's not simply an attempt. It is an attempted measure or a testing and a weighing out. And then second, I'd like to remind you, remember that all theorists tend to take the essay as something in motion. One of the more prominent voices to explain the movement that's just really inherent in forms of the essay is Aldous Huxley. Huxley argues an essay travels between three poles, and those poles are the personal, and that's lived sensory perception or experience. The concrete particular, meaning anything, really anything outside or beyond the senses of the self, so anything researched. And then third, the abstract universal, and that's the movement of the mind in the form of rumination, speculation, and really reflection writ large. So that's the formal literary context that I'm speaking from, and that's the field where I'm seeing this exciting convergence between ekphrasis and resistance. So I'm going to share with you two examples. My first example is an essay called A Civilized Man from José Orduña's book, The Weight of Shadows. A Civilized Man, this essay, takes place in a waiting room in the Neil Smith Federal Building in Des Moines, Iowa. Orduña observes a young couple whose attorney is coaching them for a Stokes interview. And that's the interview that scrutinizes a young couple's request for immigration based on their marital status, meaning just based on the fact of their marriage. So the Stokes interview is designed specifically to judge the legitimacy, the moral standing, and the substance of legal partnership itself. Because, as Orduña says, this couple being coached by their attorney, because they look like posed figures in a Renaissance painting, Orduña studies this scene, this waiting room scene, as he would a canvas. So here's an excerpt from Orduña's essay. I scribble adoration and waiting underneath my terrible drawing because the young couple and their lawyer bring to mind those figures transfixed in religious adoration from high Renaissance art. I'd seen such an image a few months earlier that had broken something of itself off, lodged slivers of its furtive psychology in my mind. So ultimately what's going to happen here is Orduña draws from the Venetian painter Andrea Mantegna's Adoration of the Magi, linking contemporary power dynamics, particularly around US immigration policy, to a historic consciousness of 1500s Europe. So we learn not only about US immigration policy, we learn about the Medici Bank, its financing of the Catholic Church, the resulting erosion of absolute monarchy, and then the real rise of trade and transaction-based power. And that trade and transaction-based power, that comes clear as the engine that drives today's US Department of Homeland Security. So I invite viewers to pause the recording anytime and check out these excerpts. Excerpt 2 explores the painting, and excerpt 3 articulates the crux of the connection that's building throughout the essay. My second example is by Aisha Sabatini Sloan. Sloan's essay, A Clear Presence, is what I'll look at. It's in her essay collection, Dreaming of Ramadi in Detroit. And then you can also find the full text of this essay, incidentally, online in Guernica magazine. I really like to contrast the José Orduña example with the Aisha Sabatini Sloan example, because while Orduña's ekphrastic resistance has to do with infusing a present day political situation with a really historic consciousness, Sloan's ekphrastic resistance unfolds more philosophically and particularly very metaphorically and imagistically. And this is to say that Sloan uses art to introduce additional layers of meaning and particularly to introduce the tension in the essay's swimming pool motif. So again, viewers can hit pause anytime to read the excerpts more closely. So here's how the essay moves into ekphrasis. Sloan writes, once I saw a set of portraits by the painter David Hockney. And Hockney helps to establish what Christopher Simon Sykes describes as an image of California as a carefree land of sunshine, affluence, and leisure by painting its wealthiest citizens and their swimming pools. But while presenting California as an idle playground for the rich, Hockney grappled with the essence of movement and time. He studied the way that sunlight manifested itself through lines of light. and you can keep reading. But this is interesting. With swimming pools, we have affluents, but we also have the problem of transparent water. That is, right? That's the problem of seeing things too clearly. This is art writing that Sloane juxtaposes brilliantly with the following historic fact. Rodney King, writes Sloane, Rodney King was swimming on the first day he ever heard the N-word. His small self popped out of the water only to be pelted by a fast passing stone. It was the first time he realized that he wasn't just a kid, he was a Black kid. Viewers, again, go ahead and pause to read the excerpts. There's a great deal of Sloane's essay that I'm leaving out, but I'm sure you will be fascinated by the essay's much later return to this Rodney King thread. So approaching the end of the essay, Sloane writes, later in life, King explains to a reporter for the New York Times, I don't want to be remembered as the person who started the riots. I'd like to be remembered for the person who threw water on the whole thing. Part of the solution, you know? And I think that's where we see the deeply poetic dimension of Sloane's ekphrastic resistance. Sloane draws on art to create and complicate and grow this truly multivalent metaphor, so that when Rodney King, whose beating by police set off the 1992 Los Angeles riots, actually, it's the jury's acquittal of the LAPD officers that sets off the riots. But anyhow, when Rodney King says something very simple at face value, I'd like to be remembered as the person who threw water on the whole thing. That simple word, water, resonates straight back into the depths of this essay that has meticulously constructed through ekphrastic dialogue with Hockney's work, the depth of intersectionalities between race, class, violence, control, and economics. And again, seeing those intersections all too clearly. So this is exactly the kind of metaphor that Mary Ruefle is talking about when she says metaphor is an event, right? By which Ruefle means metaphor is simply an exchange of energy, or metaphor is time, the time it takes for energy to transfer. In Sloane's essay, that energy transfers largely via ekphrasis, from work of art to a textual motif. Thanks, y'all.
Awesome. Okay, so now we've explored a little bit of what ekphrasis looks like in the wild over history and contemporarily, and the consequences of ekphrasis. So we're going to turn it around now to talk about how you, as a writer, can approach incorporating ekphrastic practice into your own work. So to that end, the three of us scoured the collections of the Museum of Arts and Culture, looking for a piece, a painting specifically for us to engage with, so we can show you what it looks like for each of us. So I'm going to kick us off by putting up the painting, and I'm going to talk about how I might approach constructing a personal essay that is in dialogue with a piece of art. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so the art that we're going to be approaching is a painting by Spokane artist Melissa Cole, and the title of this work is Challenge. The Museum of Arts and Culture is currently hosting an exhibition of Cole's work called Spring Fever, and there's a lot more to see of her there if anyone's local. Okay, so my take on essaying inspired by art starts with some really specific questions that then prompt me to reflect on my own experiences. So by the end of what is essentially a guided brainstorming session, I'll have a lot of material to chew on. And assuming I find some sort of meaningful meaning making churning up out of whatever it is I come up with, I will then have the beginnings of a personal essay, or at least something to refer to. So I start the process with the 5 W's: who, what, where, when, and why. And It is true that I did once go to journalism school, which might have something to do with why this is my approach, but it's applicable to a wide range of things, I think. So the first question I ask myself when I encounter our work is, what do I see? In other words, what does the work literally depict? So I had a drawing teacher once in college who said, draw what you see, not what you think you see. And this has always stuck with me as a writer, because we have sort of hazy ideas about what a thing is in our imagination, but we can often confuse bits of it in such a way that it never crystallizes completely. So for example, like we all know what a bicycle looks like, but if I gave you a blank sheet of paper and said, draw a bicycle from memory, a lot of us are going to come back with some sort of machine that has the chain connecting the tires together, right? We know that's not how it works, but if you have a bicycle in front of you that you can use for reference, then you're unlikely to make that same mistake. In any case, it's important to say what you see, to articulate it clearly to answer this question at least. So for me, you can't see it on the screen. It works better when you're in the actual museum. But the first thing that I noticed is the size of this painting. So it's taller than me, the way that it's hung in the museum. It's probably about my wingspan also. So it's fairly large painting. And then I noticed that there are two birds in a tree. They're facing each other. The white bird's eye level is right about my eye level when I encounter this in the museum. I noticed the long tails, which makes me pretty sure that these are peacocks. I noticed the colors. They're super bright. There's lots of blues and rich tones. And then getting up close to it, and it's a little difficult to see in this representation, but you can notice the texture of this painting, and not just the brushstrokes of the artist putting acrylic paint on the canvas, but there are also hundreds of jewel-looking beads of different sizes that are embedded in or sitting on top of this painting that give it a three-dimensional quality. So once I've looked hard at a piece and I'll take a notebook with me and write down literally, what do I see? What do I see? Not what do I think I see, but what do I actually see? The next move I make is to say to myself, that reminds me of something from my own life, and then fill in that blank to the best of my ability. So this usually ends up being a rabbit hole, and I'll give you a little bit of a peek inside the naughty mess of my brain, what that rabbit hole might look like for me, but it tends to get pretty digressive. So I look at this image, and the first thing that I think is about Bryce Seaby, who is a kid that I went to junior high with, who lived in this house in the small town that I grew up in, that had peacocks that were just like male peacocks that would run, at least one male peacock that just sort of ran around in their yard, were super aggressive towards pedestrians and that sort of thing. And that makes me think of Bryce Seaby's dad, who is Mr. Seaby, who is the 7th grade history teacher, who was my sister's favorite history teacher. And that makes me think of what I remember about Mr. Seaby the most is that he had a bum knee. And he had a bum knee because he hurt himself very badly doing something called frog gigging. And that makes me think, I wonder if frog gigging is even a thing outside of Southern Indiana. And that makes me think, I'm not even 100% sure what that means, but I think there's a spear involved. And thinking about frogs makes me think, I've been really meaning to look into finding out more about toads that you can lick to get high, like psychedelic toads, right? I just would like to know more about that. Pretty sure we didn't have any of those in Southern Indiana, but it might be interesting to know what their habitats are. The beads that are on top of this painting make me think of costume jewelry. And then that makes me think of my next door neighbor when I was growing up had this enormous toy chest. She lived with her dad part-time, and he bought her all of the cool stuff, but she was only in town like every other weekend. And we all loved going over to her house because she had the coolest toys, including she had the first Nintendo on the block, the Super Nintendo. And then that makes me wonder how much it would cost to buy an original Nintendo right now if I just went on the internet to do it. And that makes me remember that the only gaming system I put out my would be a play one because I spent an entire year in college playing a children's game called Spyro the Dragon on PlayStation 1, and I'd really like to see what that's like now. You get the idea. So the rabbit hole goes and goes, but you can be as digressive as you want. I do a lot of what I think of as that makes me think of ing, where one thing leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. So you get the idea with the first question, what do I see? You can take that as far as you want to go. So the second question I ask myself is, who are the characters in the work, behind the work, or omitted from the work? So here, a couple of peacocks, they're staring each other down. Let's see, there are no people in the work. There are no other animals in the work. That seems notable. The tails in this work seem almost to be like they are their own characters, given how much space they take up and the way they cascade. And I noticed that the expression on the birds' faces are alert but blank. So the next move I make there is to say to myself, that reminds me of someone from my own life. And I thought about this for a minute. Because I'm fixated on the tails, the first thing that popped into my head was my best friend's cat, Wade, has a tail that's the opposite of a peacock's tail. It's way too skinny for his giant cat body. It's pretty cute. And that makes me think, man, I have known a lot of cats in my life. I have loved a lot of cats in my life, and I'm currently catless, etc. It's sort of going down that way. The third question that I ask is where? Where is the piece set, and how do I know? So for this image, it's some kind of forest. It's a glade. It seems to be in the evening. The tree and the suggestion of stars in the background are what make me think that. It looks like a quiet place, and I think it looks quiet because of the colors. There's something about the variation of blues that makes me think this is a quiet place. So then I say to myself, that reminds me of a setting from my own life, and fill in the blank. So for thinking about this question, I thought to myself, there's something dreamlike about the motion of the curves in the image here. And peacocks are really pretty bizarre looking animals just in general. And this may not be a setting in my own life, but this image evokes the feeling I get when I'm immersed in some sort of literary construction of a world, like a fairy tale. And so that made me think specifically Ishiguro's novel, The Buried Giant, which is a beautiful book, but also very strange in the same way that this image is to me. So my fourth question, when is the work, the scene in the work, or the thing that I'm reminded of? Again, the dreamlike quality makes me feel like this is a thing out of time. And that makes me think how physics has a lot of good ideas about how what we talk about when we actually talk about time in the first place, and that now is not necessarily a place we can ever really be. And that makes me think, note to self, check on this. And that makes me think about an article I just read about something weird they just observed in the Large Hadron Collider, something about dark matter and particle decay. And that makes me think I should go check on that also. So my final question that I ask in this schema, why am I drawn into this work? What feeling does it evoke in me? And for challenge here, I love the colors, the size, and the texture of this painting. It makes me feel like I'm in a fairy tale or a dream where even the animals challenging each other have placid expressions on their faces. And I love the drama of the tails. So then I wonder, have I experienced a similar feeling in the past? And this one was really pretty surprising to me when I thought about it. The time that I've had a feeling like this in the past was the first time that I ever went snorkeling. I'd been swimming around for a little while, and of course you see fish in the water, but when I actually could put my face into the water and really see the sudden and enormous volume of life that was suddenly there just under the surface, made me feel like I'd fallen through some kind of portal into a completely different universe. And that seems to resonate with what I feel with this painting. In any case, asking myself 5 questions and 5 sort of follow-up questions. By the end of this exercise, I walked myself through junior high history class, psychedelic toads, video game nostalgia, cats that I've loved, the nature of time, and the interior quality of a hidden universe. These things aren't all related to each other, but the pattern emerging for me is a feeling of dreaminess or unreality tinged with nostalgia. So no matter what I literally write about, if it's one of those topics or something completely different, I'll be this realm, this painting, or as Courtney used the word spirit earlier, and I think that's what I achieve by looking deeply like this. So that's one way to practice, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Karina.
Awesome, thanks, Jenny. What I'm going to do for this section is share with you some writing that I did for a 20-person Yukon-based artist-writer collaboration. I participated in this relatively recently. And the structure was that 10 word artists and 10 visual artists created work in response to a shared theme, singular plurality. So the visual artists made visual art, and the word artists wrote something. That was round one. Then we exchanged our work. So we sent our writing to the visual artists, and they sent their visual art over to us, the writers. So we all got matched up with like one person's work. And then we all created a second round of work, still thinking about singular plurality, but also in response to the piece that we received from someone else. So here's my plan for this section. I will read the 200-word micro essay about singular plurality that I wrote for round one. Then I will show you the work of visual art that I received for round two. And I'll read the 200-word micro essay that I wrote in response to it. So you'll see how the micro essays build. And then I'll speak to Melissa Cole's piece, right? As if I were going into singular plurality round three, inflected by those peacocks. So the approach I'm going to be demonstrating here is from within a project that is already in motion. How does open dialogue with art inflect that project's development? And that is to say, how can we turn to art to push our thinking beyond what we could have predicted we would already do with it? Okay, so I'll start with round one. This is called Under the Bridge at Johnson's Crossing, and it's a response to the theme singular plurality. Two things fill the sky, steel beams and swallows. Erected in wartime to hold a highway, steel rises from the river bottom into a geometry of struts, stringers, and diagonals running clifftop to clifftop 100 feet up. Legions of songbirds scissor the air, swooping and diving from the truss. In the river's theater of erosion and deposition, nothing has ever been so solid as steel beams. In the forest's pulse of growth and decay, nothing has ever been so permanent. Solidity and permanence. They pull a sorrow high into the air where swallows scissor and arc, scissor and arc. But reader, perceive the nests. Mud huts pock every beam, every nut and bolt, the anchored cables, the seams joining steel to concrete. Does each tiny shelter rely on industry? Or vice versa? Does the structure rely on mounds of earth and grass, on the nestlings within, on each blade-winged parent's continual return? Likely enough, yes. Likely enough, the bridge depends entirely on so many swallows' arcing lines of flight. It is their movement in the sky that sketches steel into existence over the river. It is their movement in the sky that holds the bridge's neat lines between cliff tops. So that's my round one. And for round two, that micro essay went to a textiles artist, Françoise Laroche, who made a gorgeous visual representation of dreamscape and swallow. What I received for round two came from a ceramics artist named Astrid Cruz. And and I also have these in real life. They look like this in real life. Like so. And so I decided to write my second micro essay on the bridge at Johnson's Crossing while looking at Astrid Cruz's ceramics. So I'll read that piece for you now. This is part 2, and it's called This is the Difference Between What Stacks Up and What Cups. The steel bridge depends entirely on the swallows. Their mud nests connect the beams. Their sound thickens the air, supporting its reach from wartime to present. I watch from the river's edge 100 feet below. The bridge may depend on swallows, but it seems unmoved by the pulse of the boreal forest. Fearfully solid, permanent even, like every mistake I have ever made. I see I am beginning to wish this bridge was as temporary as a swallow's line of flight. Perhaps it can be. Perhaps the industrial structure is momentary. If there is hope against our mistakes, surely it lies in transience, inherent disappearance. This must be why I want to live in a world where it is the sound of swallows and their sound alone that supports the impossible weight of steel in the air. This must be why I seek the simple guarantee of loss. That is when a loon cries out once. A loon cries out over still water under a sky of swallows busy upholding a bridge so history can find safe passage through the air. A loon cries out and the chill hits my core. That chill, that is this life's one permanence. So now let's check out the peacocks. And I'll pretend that I was going into round 3, right? I'll pretend, let's say I'm still circling this theme of singular plurality, and that for my third micro essay about the bridge at Johnson's Crossing, that I'm going to invite this piece by Melissa Cole to inflect my thinking and influence the direction of my writing. I already know that some of the themes I'm committed to are themes of industry and ecology, additionally wartime history, that builds a very long highway across all of Yukon. Okay, but how could the peacocks help me with this? So I look at the painting. It occurs to me that swallows are birds that fly and peacocks are birds that walk around on the ground. It occurs to me that peacocks in this piece are gathered around the limb of a tree, around the forest, if you will, as opposed to gathering around industry, as the swallows gather around the steel bridge. And finally, it occurs to me that much of Melissa Cole's piece is built on circles and dots. I see outer circles with inner dots, kind of a cursory model for an amoeba or a cell. So that's a picture of life at its simplest, right? But it's also kind of a cursory model for the universe. So I see planets, galaxies, or the idea of cosmic orbits. And that's my kind of starting place. So that's where I take out the notebook. I start working the idea of atoms, of essential building blocks, maybe the bridge's elemental building blocks, the swallow's elemental building blocks, the war era's elemental building blocks, the boreal forest's elemental building blocks. And when I run out of steam, not if, when I run out of steam, I'll start working the observation that the peacocks gather around the limb of a tree, while the swallows gather around a steel beam. And when I run out of steam on that, I'll shift gears again. I'll work the contrast of flying, the swallows fly, versus walking, the peacocks walk. And maybe I'll work with additionally the contrast of swimming, because the loon swims. All in all, I'll probably generate 2,000 words in a mixture of notebooking, transcribing onto the computer, and immense further fussing on the computer. And then I will select 200 of those words, because those are the rules of this collaboration that I'm talking to you about. Word artists make 200 words or less for each round. So I would select the 200 words from my notebooking and computer fussing that take a sliver of thinking from one place to a fundamentally different place. And then on to Courtney.
Thank you, Karina. Let me share the peacocks one more time. Okay, so I think my approach is a combination of Jenny's and Karina's, and it is definitely a rabbit hole, and definitely a series of questions that I ask myself, and definitely a lot of fussing, as Karina would say as well. So I connected with this piece immediately through personal experience. Now, I live near one of the most popular parks in Las Vegas called Floyd Lamb at Tule Springs. So the park is in a rural area that tourists don't often visit. And the city works to uphold a kind of uniquely wild nature of the park. So one side of the park offers fishing lakes that host a variety of waterfowl, so geese, ducks, coots, cormorants. The other side is somewhat more tamed and maintained, and that's where the peacocks like to roam. So in truth, the peacocks are quite an attraction in this city, and locals often call Floyd Lamb the Peacock Park instead. So that's how it's colloquially known. So as a large, accessible outdoor space, the park has become even more popular with local families during the pandemic, and probably to the detriment of the wildlife. The city has responded with new signs warning visitors not to feed the wildlife under penalty of fines. In non-pandemic times, the park also serves as a site for the annual Highland Games and Celtic Festival, for which I volunteer. The peacock is a traditional Scottish symbol, and the live birds add a lot of flair and nuance to that annual event. So over the past several years, I've spent a lot of time at Floyd Lamb, and you can see how Melissa Cole's stunning painting would offer like specific and very immediate connections for me. So I could write based solely on those personal connections, and indeed I have in other venues. But to push into newer territory here, I'd need to explore additional angles in conjunction with my experience. So I could begin with the colors here, which are quite vibrant, but still somewhat more muted than in real life. Colloquially and collectively, we call these birds peacocks, but we can technically differentiate between the male peacocks and the female peahens by name. Getting back to the color, the back of the top peafowl, who presents to me as typically male in plumage and posture. The back is generally more green than yellow in my experience. Likewise, the bottom peafowl, who strikes me as female at first glance, is often gray or brown rather than white, although there is a breed of all white peacocks. But at this point is where I see my initial assumptions have led me astray, and I need to reevaluate those. So I see Cole's title challenge, and I presume a male-female dichotomy, which could be a grave error on my part. So in actuality, only peacocks, the males, have the tail plumage, so not the peahens. So if we stick to the biological facts here, at least as I know them, I'm not an expert, just a longtime observer. What we probably have here is two male peacocks involved in some type of territorial challenge. So perhaps overfeeding, breeding, roosting, nesting, etc. So I have witnessed these types of battles daily in the Peacock Park. At this point in my really close consideration of the painting, I can't help but recall more of my firsthand observations of the peafowl in my area. So I first think of wee children who are left to run amok to chase the peafowl. So we put a stop to that nonsense when we see it. I tell them a little story. I doubt this is true, but when I was a kid, I was ordered not to chase the birds on our farm. We had chickens and turkeys and ducks, as the fright could give them heart attacks. So I also tell the children in the park this little white fib, which is probably not true. And even when they challenge me on it, which they have, they generally stop chasing long enough to start to consider the peacock's perspective. And that's my real motivation here, to allow these marvelous creatures to enjoy their park home without the threat of violence. So heart attacks set aside, they deserve to exist in peace. Indeed, the posted signs require visitors to neither molest, don't touch, nor feed the wildlife. So the park is not truly wild, but it is a kind of refuge for all its creatures, including me, as I miss my rural upbringing in Kentucky. And so that conversation with the children may eventually become a key scene in a short story, a kind of challenge that I could play upon. Another example involves an adult who should have known better. So the Peacock Park used to be a ranch, even a divorce ranch for a time, where non-Nevadans could set up residency for quickie divorces, but that's probably a different story for a different time. So suffice it to say that many of the ranch's amenities have been retained and restored as historical artifacts, including the foreman's house and the water tower and other buildings. Each spring, the peahens like to nest behind the foreman's house. And if you're observant enough, you'll not get too close to the peacock who guards that nest. The man who should have known better didn't read the peacock's cues correctly, and the peacock charged him. The man kicked out of the peacock, not once, but at least twice. I came upon this scene in medias res, and the man backed off just as I felt it necessary to intervene. The man did shout at me, and he said, "Did you see it attack me?" And I had no good words for him, so I just shook my head, passed him by. But a fictional scene might play out differently, like to make amends, at least in my little heart, for what I kind of see now as my personal failure to better protect the peacock's habitat. I'd certainly give another character the right words for the right moment. I'd let that challenge unfold in a more intense, dramatic, and probably more satisfactory manner to me. So I'd want to stay true to the nature of the Papa Peacock, but all the other elements could be more malleable. So getting back into the painting, this is a process of moving in and out of the painting, as both Jenny and Karina have described. So I'm getting back to the painting, and thus far I've considered color, gender, the app title, challenge, as filtered through my personal experience. Already I have two scenes that might work for me, but now I need to move back in to get more material for the fiction. So I want to further explore the positioning of the peacocks. The bluish peacock seems dominant, but the whitish peacock seems defiant to me. So I asked myself, who is challenging whom here? To whom does this tree belong? Who is allowed to perch or roost in this location? I see again a need to challenge my own assumptions. To be honest, I'm still struggling a little bit with that initial knee-jerk male-female dichotomy. I asked myself, is that why I reprimanded the small children and not the grown man? Would the man have challenged me in a way that made me feel unsafe? So I don't want to actually anthropomorphize the peafowl themselves. I want them to be who they are. But I'm continuing to reframe their challenge in human terms based on the filter of my experiences. Yet, I also ask myself, does that shift reduce the peafowl to mere symbols? So I don't have good answers to those questions at this stage in my writing process, but I think I'm asking myself the right questions. So thinking of those questions, let my subconscious chew on those a bit, I dip back again into the details of the painting. So what strikes me next is all the eyes in Cole's painting, and not just in the intricate tail feathers. I see eyes in the leaves of the tree, and in the evening sky, and in the grasses and bushes on the ground. Even the crests of the peacocks, those little fans atop their head, are like black and white eyes to me. Even if I just focus on the two actual biological eyes of the peafowl, I still feel watched or maybe even surveilled. Yet, I then wonder if the two birds can actually directly confront one another in such close proximity, given the position of the eyes on the sides of their little tiny heads. So it makes me think of side-eye glances, the way birds will cock their head to look at you, or the way humans will pass judgment with a skewed glare. These ideas play into my earlier scenarios, but also lead me to the signage again, the signage in the park. The city park managers make the rules to protect the wildlife and then watch for rule breakers. Call it vision, perspective, surveillance, or simply the gaze. The painting embodies the concept of the challenge with these eyes. I would want to honor that intent, even if only metaphorically. So as we return to the earlier concept of intent, I'm going to transition us again into more of a how-to portion of our panel. So bear with me while I share another piece of artwork with you. Okay. So I just spoke about how I would probably approach the peacock picture for an ekphrastic short story. And while I'm still, even now I'm just contemplating, thinking how I would do that. I don't have anything to offer you right now as a product. But at the beginning of the panel, I did mention a published story of my own that propelled me further into the world of ekphrasis, both its practice and its scholarship. So my story is based on this painting by Darren Orange. He's a visual artist now based in Astoria, Oregon. The painting is called Self-Portrait, and Darren has told me that it currently hangs in his mother's house. So I found the painting through an Ekphrastic contest prompt online, but as I misread or missed that deadline, I ended up submitting the finished story elsewhere, and it got picked up by a very cool British magazine called Dyslexia. So as I did for the other paintings, I'll leave up Self-Portrait for you to ponder while I talk. So upon first glance, I felt pulled toward the mystery of the man in the painting. His straw hat, his shadowed face, his denim shirt unbuttoned. But the background really spoke to me too. A forgotten field in the middle of nowhere, the stark solitude of that field, of that moment, all that reverberated through me. So the field for me posed a primary intent, but I also wanted the man to have his say in the story. And here's how I began. Quote, Darren lived alone in the woods that used to be farms once upon a time. He'd wander and find a hayfield, overgrown but still recognizable as hay for horses. Where were the horses? Were they wild now or dead? He'd give anything to find a wild horse, especially a dead one, a skeleton to study during these long days of solitude. End quote. So in the body of the piece, I explore Darren's story from several angles. I offer alternative backstories that bring Darren to these woods, and those options allow Darren access to alternative current realities. Even from the introduction, you may get a sense that Darren is headed down a dark path. I almost called the story a skeleton to study, as that phrase captured Darren's mood and approach to memory quite well. But during revision, Darren's relationship to the red fox, whether real or imagined, became more primary. For the end, I returned to the field. And the story was called The Red Fox, if I didn't mention that before. So, quote, a heady musk rises to Darren's face. You need some Irish Spring, Fox, Darren says. But he sniffs at his own armpit and realizes that, as a human, he smells worse than any animal. Darren slows and reaches a hand toward the red fox, a gesture of apology. The fox snaps teeth, growls so low it seems to come from the tip of his tail. Darren hurries on, calling out to the fox. Darren cries aloud, and the fox yowls in response. They reach the hayfield at last, bursting through the dense tree line like ancient hunters, like ancient monsters, come to clear the land and make it edible. So, much like the original painting, the story probably raises more questions than it answers. But what answers they may offer in tandem are best left to the interpretation of the viewer or the reader. One of the editors of Dyslexia described the story as such. So, quote, here was a story that felt curiously unreliable, right from its fairy tale-like opening. And the uncertainty that accompanies this story's carefully constructed weirdness is where I feel closest to the wildness of wildlife, end quote. So it thrilled me to know that the story retained its wildness, its weirdness, its wide openness. I felt that same sense of wilderness when I first saw Self-Portrait by Darren Orange, but I needed to make that idea my own for the story to work on its own as well. I'll wrap up the fiction writer's viewpoint of ekphrastic process with a quote from Donna Beyer-Stein, who wrote Scenes from the Heartland, stories based on lithographs by Thomas Hart Benton. She says, by imaginatively playing with a visual work of art, the writer can expand its meaning, not in terms of enlarging the original work, but in terms of offering more possibilities. By bringing two imaginations into conversation with one another, that of the visual artist and that of the writer, something new is born. Not something that supersedes the original, but something unique. And I think Jenny is next.
Thank you, Courtney. Okay, yeah, so the last portion of our session here, we're going to try to give you some concrete tools that Courtney was beginning to send our way, stuff that you can use if you want to explore ekphrasis on your own. And to that end, I'm just going to throw up a slide that has those questions and sub-questions that I asked myself looking at Melissa Cole's work earlier. So you can take a screenshot or what have you. If you are the sort of writer who benefits from super scaffolding. So I ask, what do I see? What does the work literally depict? That reminds me of something from my own life. Who are the characters in the work, behind the work, omitted from the work? Where is the piece set? How do I know? When is the work, the scene in the work, or the theme I'm reminded of? Why am I drawn in by this work? You can take this little handy 5 W's and apply it to music, to sculpture, to paintings, to even other texts if you wanted to go a little bit deeper into what your experience of the thing in front of you is. So take what you like from it. I believe Karina has more to say about what things you might consider as you construct an essay.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about teaching ekphrasis in the context of the college classroom. And I suppose this material could, of course, be adapted to different learning contexts as well. But I'll start with a story about José Orduña, author of The Weight of Shadows, which I excerpted earlier to help talk about ekphrastic resistance. So José Orduña, he sat down to give a craft talk. I sat down to hear his craft talk. He showed us a photograph of the US-Mexico wall. And he pointed out that while prominent political voices are calling to build the wall already exists. This, said Orduña, pointing at the photograph of the US-Mexico wall, this is my occasion to write. And for me, that phrase clicked perfectly. And I've used it ever since. The occasion to write is a useful concept that helps me link 2 different course goals in my introduction to the nonfiction essay. One major course goal is to expose students to contemporary trends in nonfiction. Another major goal is to coax students into writing beyond or outside themselves. So I'm going to talk through an ekphrastic writing assignment I created that combines art, history, and conversation. And that's designed to multiply students' own occasions to write. So here's the lesson sequence, part 1. Part 1, I assigned a civilized man. That's the 5th essay in José Orduña's 2016 book, The Weight of Shadows. So you remember that a civilized man takes place in the waiting room at the Neil Smith Federal Building in Des Moines, Iowa. And you remember that Orduña dialogues with the Venetian painter Andrea Mantegna's adoration of the Magi, linking US immigration policy to the Medici Bank, its financing of the Catholic Church, the resulting erosion of absolute monarchy in Europe, and then the rise remember, of trade and transaction-based power. In class, our analysis focused on disentangling just one central question. What is the role of the artwork in this essay's whole assemblage of meanings and effects? What is the role of the artwork? In one activity, I had students track exactly what percent of the text describes adoration of the Magi, what percent of the text teaches context about adoration of the Magi, and what percent of the text explicitly connects adoration of the Magi to the waiting room or to the present dayness of the essay. And I will show you the handout that I made, on which I asked students to track precisely these things. I asked them to do it, like pseudoscientifically, actual page numbers, and then in the end, given an actual approximate statistic statement, what percent of the essay is about the art and what percent of the essay is about something other than the art. So students have to create a retrospective structure of the essay, and when they do this, they discover the bulk of the essay is not about the artwork at all. But of course, the closer they looked and the more they discussed, there were more and more tacit connections, between art and US immigration policy that arise. So is it an essay that just touches on a Renaissance painting here and there? Or is that painting actually woven in between the lines on every page? Ultimately, it looks like it's the latter. So lesson sequence part 2 takes us to research and writing. So second, students read excerpts from Jericho Parham's Ekphrastic essay collection, Lost Wax, and we took a field trip to our campus's Museum of Art and Archaeology, where students did a good deal of free writing. They had a few days to expand that free writing into a 500-word Ekphrastic essay, responding to any artwork encountered at the museum. For example, 2 students wrote essays dialoguing with Rembrandt paintings. One student worked with an ancient Indian carving of Ganesha. Another took a work of American Impressionism as muse, and several of my students wrote essays sparked by the time that they spent with sculptures and photographs from the museum's curated exhibit of works by emerging young artists with disabilities. And again, pause this presentation at any time to read the instructions on the slides. In the next stage of research exploration, so this is after students wrote their 500-word Ekphrastic responses to the museum field trip. In the next stage of research exploration, students read Ted Kuzer's essay, Small Rooms in Time, as a model for combining historic research with present-day experiences and memories. They then turned to print and online sources to gather historic research of their own. So students chose to turn up sources on their artists, for example. Some of them chose to turn up sources on the medium. So one student learned about the development of acrylic paints, for instance, and another researched the history of still photography. And some students looked for context on the countries or the social context in which their artworks were created. So the student writing about Ganesha, for example, made a valiant effort to grasp some Hindu literary and mythological tradition. So here's an observation, and I think it's significant. Most students came away from this research actually less satisfied with their initial take on the chosen artwork, which is to say, they came away more curious about that art. So in a 500-word micro essay, students had to marshal this new information and creatively convey the most intriguing things that they learned. They read an excerpt of Jamaica Kincaid's A Small Place as a model for truly gorgeous writing. that teaches us something utterly beyond the narrator's personal experiential universe. Finally, part 3 of this research exercise required students to have a conversation. I asked them to identify a theme or topic in their ekphrastic writing assignment. So that's the work that they did back at the museum. And they had to think of a person with whom they'd be able to have a lively 5 to 10 minute conversation about any theme or topic related to what they saw at the museum. So then another 500-word micro essay came out of that exercise. Ultimately, students then assembled their work into long-form ekphrastic essays that used dialogues with art and historic research and the human voice to explore really a range of convictions, a range of questions, memories, and experiences. And this is important to me. They discovered that from the headwaters of the initial research, right, back at the museum, looking at a piece of art, they discovered that their thinking traveled really unexpected distances once they interacted with historic questions and with a human conversation. So what do students learn from this kind of lesson sequence, or from this lesson sequence in particular? I emphasized craft strategies and how-tos, how to write about art, how to connect art to something else you're writing about, but also the basics that we have to remember every day of our lives, the importance of sensory perception and concrete detail. But the literary studies component of this lesson sequence is probably more significant. Students came away with a new recognition of a notable trend in the contemporary essay. Nonfiction writing about art is flourishing right now. And this is a significant insight to put within students' reach, because more popular and mainstream conceptions of nonfiction rarely look past memoir and kind of the story of my life. But by reading and writing ekphrastic nonfiction, students experience an occasion to write that exceeds their individuality. And that's part of my value system, really. Ultimately, my hope for any student is that they leave this semester seeing the essayist as part of a wider thinking community, someone who's in conversation with the world in which they're embedded and responsible to and for it. Thanks.
We've come to the end. That'll about do it for us. We've followed ekphrasis and history all the way through how you can incorporate the practice into your own work. And even if you never end up writing something that communicates directly with a piece of art in another form, the experience of thinking through a process like this can enrich whatever it is you do write. So ultimately, we hope this is encouragement, and also support your local art museum. So thank you a million to Get Lit and the Museum of Arts and Culture for hosting us. This has been a lot of fun, and thanks for joining us.
Wow, that was great. Thank you all so much for that presentation. That was really wonderful and so inspiring. Some of the goals for the festival are to celebrate the arts and inspire creativity. And I think this presentation did both of those things really beautifully. So thank you again, Karina, Courtney, and Jenny for this presentation. And for our audience at home, don't forget that you can learn more about all of these writers, check out other festival events, and donate to help support Get Lit on our website, getlitfestival.org. Thank you again for joining us. Bye, everybody.